Thank you for downloading this podcast from Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk. For more podcasts and more information on your number one news and talk station, please visit 702.co.za or capetalk.co.
Talking Sex on Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk with Redi Tlhabi.
Our guest today, Michael Doré, who lives in Coventry and has a PhD in mathematics from Warwick University. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm very fascinated by what we're talking about today. And I must just, Michael, declare my ignorance. I always thought there were people who were sexual, those who were celibate, and those who were not sexual because they were ill perhaps, or because of some emotional trauma. But I didn't know that there was something called asexuality. Tell me about it.
Yeah, well, actually, I have to say your introduction was excellent on the previous part of the program. It got all the facts pretty much spot on. I mean, you know, it's actually very usual for there to be a lack of awareness out there, and, you know, asexuality is gradually it's gradually getting cultural inroads, but gradually making inroads into culture. But, you know, until very recently, very few people even heard of asexuality. So what is asexuality? Asexuality is quite simply the lack of experience of sexual attraction. So everybody has certain people they're not sexually attracted to. Asexual people just find that everybody falls into that category. We see asexuality as really a sexual orientation. So there's homosexuality, being sexually attracted to the same sex. There's heterosexuality, being sexually attracted to the opposite sex. There's bisexuality, being sexually attracted to both sexes. So, you know, it stands to reason that there should be a fourth option there. Asexuality, sexually attracted to nobody.
And what would the reasons be, Michael, or has that not been explored?
I think that it's very much unknown. Not very much research has been done into the sort of scientific, the sort of hard medical side of it. Some people think it might be genetic. Others think that, very speculatively, maybe it's to do with hormone levels, but there's really no evidence for either of those two things. Other people think it might be to do with some traumatic occurrence in childhood, but I mean, you know, I didn't have one of those, and many other asexual people are, you know, are quite happy with their lives, and they haven't had, you know, they've not been abused, and I think it's really, instead of asking why asexuality exists, the way I like to look at it is, why shouldn't it exist? You know, we have every other option, so, you know, it would be quite surprising if there was nobody at all who was sexually attracted to no one.
And just on that, Michael, I mean, how does your own journey of identifying as asexual, how long did it take? What questions did you have to ask yourself before you finally arrived at that point where you identified yourself as asexual and accepted it and actually said there's nothing to explain?
Yeah, so I think I realised I was asexual quite early, actually, in the mid-90s when I was in my early or mid-teens. This was before any community existed, so we have now a large community called AVEN, Asexual Visibility and Education Network, mostly online, but this was before all that, and what happened was I started to notice there was something different about me when I was around 13. All the boys in my class became crazy about girls. I was in an all-male school, and I simply couldn't relate to this. It was a bit like they were speaking a different language, or I was missing a sixth sense. And I even though I identified as asexual to myself, just because it made sense, you know, we've all heard the term asexual from biology, even though this has a different meaning. I didn't actually talk about it openly, simply because there wasn't very much awareness out there, and there seemed to be a great intolerance towards anybody who doesn't fancy the opposite sex. Yeah. With many people assuming that you're gay or in denial. So it was years later when I started becoming open, especially when I started actually talking about it and trying to raise awareness in the outer world. Because, you know, my asexuality is not an obsession to me, just like, you know, most people's heterosexuality is not what defines them, or homosexuality or whatever. It's just what I am. And so, for the most part, I didn't have that much reason to talk about it.
But is there a certain pressure that you felt, though, or that some asexuals that you interact with feel? Because the reality is that we are living in a society or an environment that is rather obsessed with sex, I think.
There's very much a pressure. I think there's a great pressure on. There's a sort of implicit assumption that everybody likes sex. It's not even sort of asked. It's just you're human, therefore you like sex, or even especially you must be heterosexual. And so I find that many asexuals find it difficult to, they're often pressured into actually being something that they're not. And this can take its toll. I mean, just speaking for myself, I'm not actually too bothered about, what people call over-sexualized culture. I mean, I do understand it, and, I understand there are problems. But on the other hand, I'm quite happy for people to have sex, and, I'm not against consensual sex at all. Sex is great as long as it's not abusive and it's consensual.
Sure.
I don't mind sexual references in popular culture. I would like more recognition that it's not for everybody.
I've got some SMSs here, very interesting questions. I think many people, not just me, are fascinated. There's somebody who sent an SMS saying that she used to be very sexually active in her youth, and now she's just totally lost interest in sex. I suspect that's quite different from what we're talking about, because somebody who loses interest and never ever wants to have sex would be different from somebody who doesn't feel any sexual attraction. Is this something that can come or go, or is it a permanent state?
I would say asexuality is usually permanent, but I don't want to rule out the idea that people's sexuality can really change. It's important to distinguish asexuality from a lack of libido. So libido or sex drive is something that often shifts. Sometimes it decreases in people as they get older, not always. And sometimes it can depend on life circumstances. We distinguish asexuality. So asexuality is really a lack of directed sex drive. It's possible to actually have a sex drive and yet still be asexual. To answer the question, I think that most people who identify as asexual have always been asexual. But, we can't say for definite that sexuality is fixed and immutable, because that's not been proven either.
I find this question very fascinating from one of our listeners. She wants to know, if you are asexual, does that mean you don't respond to touch at all? And there's another SMS that says, if someone who's asexual were to be stimulated, would they not react at all?
I think that very much depends person to person. In general, an asexual person might actually experience arousal in exactly the same way as a non-asexual person. It's because arousal is often a sort of automatic bodily response. It doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily the same as actually being sexually attracted. I think that, heterosexual people can relate to this. Sometimes, you can be aroused by somebody, especially by being touched in a certain way, even if you're not really sexually attracted to them. And I think it's the same with asexual people, that, some of us can be aroused in certain circumstances, but, we still don't experience sexual attraction.
And most people, Michael, would define sex as or something that you do with someone else. But people masturbate, people self-stimulate. Would an asexual person not even go there?
That very much depends from person to person. There are some asexual people who do and some who don't. Again, it really comes down to libido. Like I say, asexuality is not the same as a lack of libido. This is actually quite a difficult concept to understand, because, at first sight, lack of sex drive and asexuality sound like they're the same thing. So the best analogy I ever heard to explain this difference was, imagine that, say, you're a heterosexual man living on a desert island, and on this desert island everybody else is male. Then, you're not sexually attracted to anybody, so operationally speaking, you're asexual. You don't experience sexual attraction. But, you still have the same sex drive as everybody else, even if there's nobody there that you want to actually have sex with. And so, in such circumstances, you'd expect people to, self-stimulate or masturbate, like you say.
I'm chatting to Michael Doré, who is talking to us about asexuality, and we're trying to understand this, and we'd love to hear your stories or any questions that you have for him. Do give us a call on 021-446-0567 or 11-883-0702. I'm getting a lot of SMSs on this subject. There's no shame, there's nothing. Let's just share our experiences and be well informed. I always think it's better to share information and be empowered. Michael, I am curious to know then, so can we also define asexuality as a lack of sexual orientation, or it's another form of sexual orientation?
I think that's mostly a matter of semantics. I mean, it depends on how you define the term sexual orientation. I mean, to me, it makes sense to actually consider asexuality as a sexual orientation, simply because, well, I mean, the way I think of it is that, we have bisexual people, that they have a sexual orientation. We don't say they have two sexual orientations because they're attracted to men and to women. We just say they have one sexual orientation. So the sexual orientation is just really an overarching category that that describes whom you're sexually attracted to. So, from my point of view, we have a sexual orientation, but it doesn't matter. Like, if you want to say we have no sexual orientation, then that's okay too.
I also read, Michael, that there is a significant debate over whether asexuality is a disorder or not. From what you're saying, definitely that's not your interpretation of it. But I'd like to know at a professional level how the subject is being approached.
At the moment, there's not very much actually published on the subject academically. I know this is indeed a raging debate, like you say. Most asexual people would say that, it's not a disorder simply because it doesn't make us unhappy. Like, some people who are asexual might have a disorder for some other reason, but they wouldn't think that there's any connection between any of their disorders and asexuality. There are other people who are quite happy with their life, and a disorder, it feels like it should be something that actually makes you unhappy or causes discomfort in some way, and asexuality doesn't do that. As far as it goes at the professional level, I know that in the USA there's a debate going on currently about the DSM. I believe that's called Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which it gives a list of mental health disorders. And not asexuality, but there's a disorder in there I think it's called hyposexuality. So it's really closer to lack of libido than asexuality. But there are many asexual people who feel that this disorder should be removed from the DSM.
Okay, let's go to the lines. Julian, you're calling us from Sandton. Good morning.
Hello, Redi. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Good. Just a question for Michael. Michael, I'm curious, is there a direct correlation between IQ, traditional intelligence, and asexuality? In other words, is it a situation where the person who may be asexual is particularly focused or engrossed or taken up with discovering and operating on an academic plane, which is so much higher that there's no space left for a particular sexual experience?
Okay, that's Julian in Sandton. Michael, how would you answer that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I would say no. I think most asexual people would say no as well. Most of us don't feel more intelligent than anybody else. It's just, most of us know people who are sexual who are much more intelligent than ourselves. I guess what it made, sometimes people who are asexual may have more time on their hands. I mean, not always, but simply because sometimes asexuality causes people not to be so worried about relationships and, romantic relationships. And that's not universally true, by the way, but just sometimes that's what happens. In which case, I guess they may have more time to devote to studying and things. As far as the natural correlation between IQ and asexuality, most of us think no, but, we can't prove either way.
Okay, and let's go to Tammy in Centurion. Good morning to you, Tammy.
Hi, Redi. I just wanted to find out from Michael, seeing as an asexual person doesn't have any sexual attraction to another person, how do they deal with relationships or being lonely? Because I'm assuming that a relationship stems from a sexual attraction to another person, and then you then take it from there and then move into a relationship with someone. How does an asexual person deal with a lack of relationship or being in a relationship?
In fact, the question is, do they have relationships? Because we can't conclude that there's a lack of relationship because there is no sex, can we, Tammy? But anyway, Michael, how do you answer that?
Yeah, great question and good point as well. You're entirely right that, in fact, some asexuals don't have romantic relationships, but actually many of them do. So what the asexual community does is it distinguishes between sexual orientation and romantic orientation. So, we say that people are hetero-romantic if they are, attracted to the, opposite gender, but in a romantic sense, not in a sexual sense. And somebody could be homo-romantic if they are attracted to the same gender, romantically. And so you could be a hetero-romantic asexual, a homo-romantic asexual, a bi-romantic asexual that's attracted to both genders romantically, or even an aromantic asexual, romantically attracted to nobody. And so many asexual people do actually have relationships, and with a lot of work on both sides, such relationships can actually work. Of course, there are problems. There are problems especially when an asexual person gets into a relationship with somebody who is not asexual, and there's not really an awareness of the person's asexuality at the start of the relationship. That can sometimes lead to difficulties, because then, one partner expects sex, the other doesn't expect sex. But the key is openness. I think that if an asexual person gets into a relationship with somebody who's not asexual and is very open about it at the start, then often these relationships actually can work out very well. That's the first answer. The first answer is that actually many asexual people do have romantic relationships, and we tend not to see romance and sex as really so intertwined. I realise that, we're just speaking for asexual people there. A lot of people, romance and sexuality are very much intertwined, but for most asexual people, they're actually sort of separate, and it can be quite hard for us to understand why there's a connection. We kind of respect the fact there is a connection for most people, but for us, it's not really so much there. The other thing I'd say is that, even without a relationship, many asexual people can be happy. We can form relationships on a friendly basis, or platonic relationships perfectly well, and also there's a very supportive asexual community out there, though unfortunately this is mostly so far in the West, it seems, but I find that often, people might spend their weekends going to meet with people who are asexual and sort of hanging out with them while everybody else is going out with their partner.
Talking Sex on Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk with Redi Tlhabi.
Michael Doré is my guest, and we are talking about asexuality. He identifies as asexual, and we are on Skype, so there may be some interruption, and the line is not as clear as it would be if someone were in the studio, but it is. We can hear exactly what he's saying, so let's just make it work. Okay, and we are taking your calls on 021-446-0567, 011-883-0702. We're taking your SMSs as well on 31702 and 31567. Let's go to Donovan in Belleville. Hi there, Donovan.
Hi, Redi. Great show.
Thank you.
Quick question. Asexuals, or let me put it this way, we have sex for enjoyment and we have sex for, making babies and so on. Does asexuals not want children? How do you deal with them? I'll listen by the radio.
Oh, so they don't have children, you're saying?
Yeah, don't they want to have children?
Don't they want to? Okay. Michael?
Again, it depends very much from person to person. There are definitely asexuals who have had children. Some asexuals are in relationships. In fact, many asexual people have actually been married for sort of 30, 40 years and have had kids, and then only afterwards have said, asexual, that actually does fit me. Because, again, asexuality is really about lack of sexual attraction. It's quite possible to be asexual and to have sex, and many people actually have. For other asexuals, having children isn't such a great priority. So there are many reasons people choose to have sex, and so a lot of them do apply to asexuals, and that's a very good example given by Donovan.
So you would say then, Michael, I want to be sure that I understand you correctly, that an asexual person who feels no sexual attraction doesn't necessarily mean is incapable of having sex for whatever reason.
Absolutely. An asexual person is quite capable of having sex. Well, it really depends person to person. I mean, there are some asexual people who actually don't mind sex particularly, and there are other asexual people who are really, what we say is repulsed. They really don't like the idea at all. And, I mean, I'm in the latter category. I'm somebody who wouldn't be happy having sex. But, I don't speak for everybody, and there are many asexual people who are quite happy to. And, I mean, this is an interesting difference, but I think actually the same variation exists with people who are not asexual.
Yes.
There are some people who are quite happy to have sex with people they're not sexually attracted to. And there are other people who would be horrified by the idea of having sex with somebody that they're not sexually attracted to. And so asexual people are just the same, except just we're not sexually attracted to anybody, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I hear you completely. Let's go to Abby. Abby, you are calling us from Randburg. Hi.
Yes, hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I completely agree with Michael. It occurred to me years ago with the Castor Semenya debate, actually. I read an article that they've identified scientifically about 5 different sexual categories, and one of them, they said, was asexual. And I thought, oh my goodness, yes, there I am. Because I never really understood why. I mean, I could have sex with people, but I never really, I couldn't ever really relate to this absolute passion people for the rest of the world had for sex. I mean, it just didn't seem, important. And I completely agree with Michael. I think I'm in that category too.
Mm-hmm. Were you? Did you feel pressurized at all, Abby? Did you feel like you were an outsider?
In my younger days, women were very pressurized to have relationships and be in with the crowd and having relationships, and so I felt a lot of pressure in those days. But as I've grown up, I've realized, no, wait a minute, find your own space, girl. And this was my own space, and it worked very well for me.
Lovely. But Michael, do you agree that not everybody's in that comfortable space as Abby and yourself, that there are people perhaps who'd feel there's something wrong with me, I need some psychological help, I'm an outsider and so on. In your groups or in your interactions with other asexuals, they must all have varied stories about how they made sense of their identity.
So many people grow up where, heterosexuality is the default, and so anything that differs from that is automatically sort of pathologized, and this is a problem that a lot of asexual people do face, and it was great to hear from Abby, actually, and I think that many people in the asexual community can relate to that story quite well, in that, asexuality is something that's kind of always been there, but it's not necessarily something they've had to identify as for all these years. I've even heard from asexual people who actually sort of are surprised that anybody at all experiences sexual attraction. They kind of sort of feel that, well, sex is just something you have to do. And then it's actually a surprise to them when they find the asexual community, they start actually believing that other people do experience sexual attraction. Because there's actually this difference. So I say that it very much does depend person to person. There are some people like myself who asexuality was always there, and it was always I just wouldn't be happy having sex at all. And there are other people who they wouldn't have even identified as asexual, except that eventually there's a community out there that's that helps people find out who they are.
But Michael, I'm still I'm still trying to work this in my head. Would you not have had to have sex at some point in your life to know that you're not interested in it, you feel no attraction, or you can arrive at that point of I'm asexual without ever had sex?
I would argue that you can deduce your sexual orientation without even having sex. So, I mean, an easy way to explain this is that, most people who are straight, they don't need to have sex with the same gender in order to show that they're not bisexual. Or somebody who is gay usually knows they are gay even without trying to have sex with the same gender. The opposite gender.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think asexual people are very much like that. It's, some asexual people have tried to have sex, and usually what's happened is confirmed to them, yeah, I'm definitely asexual.
I get that completely, because, you'd interview somebody who's gay or somebody who battled to come out, and they'll tell you, I knew from when I was a child, I was always attracted to boys. So it would make sense that if you're asexual, you identify that very early on. Great answer. But I've got this question via SMS, Michael. It says, being an asexual woman gives me a great sense of freedom. My friend have needs from partners which I don't have. These needs sometimes dominate their lives to their detriment. Can you identify with that, especially that sense of freedom? And I imagine the freedom from living your life and having your own identity without having to live up to what society dictates is right or wrong or normal or not.
Well, I think that I think that the last part is definitely correct in that, it's great. It's very liberating to be able to just say, look, I'm asexual and that's who I am and I don't have to conform to anybody else. As regards the earlier point, I mean, okay, there are some people who are sexual who might find that sex controls them, but I mean, most people who are sexual I know are not controlled by sex. It's just one part of their life, and I would say asexual people are just different. I wouldn't say it's like better or it's not. I wouldn't say it necessarily is easier to be asexual. It's just different, and I think that it's all about recognizing that, you know, it's whom you're sexually attracted to is not something you can control, and you know, it's just something that shouldn't be. It should just be accepted for whatever it is.
And again, Michael, I kind of understand the being indifferent to sex, not being attracted to another person, but the other side of asexuals who may be horrified or disgusted even by the idea of sex. And I can almost hear some heterosexuals who also say, I was abused, or I don't like how sex is dominating people's lives. I'm also, as a heterosexual, horrified and disgusted by the idea of sex.
I understand, but I mean, it's not such an unusual concept. I mean, there are many people who are, say, heterosexual who would find the idea of having sex with somebody who's the same gender really quite, you know, it would really put them off. That doesn't necessarily mean they're anti-gay. I mean, we're not anti-sex, and, you know, somebody could be perfectly pro-gay and yet still be, you know, quite, you know, the idea of themselves having sex with the same gender is really something they just don't want to go near. And I think that some asexual people are like that. You know, we're perfectly happy with other people having sex. As long as it doesn't involve ourselves, then we're fine with it. But when it starts involving ourselves, then we get very much squicked out, and that's where I am. But I don't speak for everybody.
Yeah, Michael, I've really loved chatting to you, and our listeners as well have responded very, very well to this. And I think we're learning something every day, and that's what excites me about life, really, that nothing is in black and white, and there's so many different identities, and they make life even more enjoyable. Thank you for chatting to us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Bye-bye. Michael Doré, who is asexual. He is, by the way, a doctor of mathematics at Warwick University in the UK. That conversation will also be available as a podcast. Lots of questions that we covered around asexual debate, and I'm glad I'm not the only one who is fascinated by this. But I've got a follow-up question for those of you who have taken a break from sex for whatever reason, whether it is spiritual, whether it's to give you more energy, to help you focus even more. And I'm asking this because at certain times, depending on your own belief, there are people who fast, right? Different religions fast, and it's meant to be a time of very heightened spiritual engagement with your creator, with the dictates of your religion, your faith, and so on. So the fast is significant. I know in the Catholic tradition, during Lent, you give something up, right? It's not just Catholic, hey? Okay, let me not speak with authority, but I can only talk about how I was brought up. So that's what it was, and there could be others. So you give something up as a way of really getting into that core, you know, that spiritual part of you, and making sacrifices. And I do know that a lot of Christians do that when they're going through a difficult time. They would give up food and fast and pray at the same time, go on a retreat. Again, I'm not saying other religions don't. I can only reflect the religion that I'm most familiar with, or was most familiar with as a child. But when it comes to sex, does that happen? Is there some spiritual connection between a lack of sex, or those of you who've chosen to be celibate? We're not talking about asexuality, because there's quite a distinction. There's somebody who's who sent a tweet saying, I don't pick up any difference between being celibate and being asexual. That's fine. That's your interpretation of it. But the definition of asexuality is exactly that you feel no attraction, no desire to have sex. Even if you would have sex because you want to have a child or for whatever reason, you still don't feel the attraction. Meanwhile, you can be celibate and be attracted to someone and feel sexual feelings, but still choose not to do anything about it. So I would like to hear from those of you who've given up sex for whatever reason. Not those who are not interested in sex. That's different. Or because of some illness or some medication, you've given it up. That's different. But somebody who wakes up and say, actually, I enjoy this, I love it, but I don't want to do it because I want to get in touch with my spiritual side. I want to reflect on the meaning of it. Or you put it in the same category as a fast. So let's call it a sexual fast. Thomas looks bewildered because he's never ever experience what we're talking about. It's okay, Thomas. You're not the only one. You're a normal man. Give us a call, please. I'm very fascinated by this on 021 446 0567 011 883 0702. We are taking your SMSs as well on 31702 and 31567. There's an email that says, Redi, I was going through a particularly difficult time, and I truly believe that we reach a higher spiritual level when we deprive ourselves of things that we enjoyed. So for me, sex was the first thing to go. I let it go so that I can have deeper meaning and find time to meditate and reflect. Okay? So that's exactly, you got it. You got the question that I'm asking you, Samantha. Giving up sex for any spiritual reason or because you want to find out whether you're capable of doing without it. If you were to make a choice to give up sex for whatever reason, would you do it? Can you do it? Because many say that we are living in a very sex-obsessed community and society. Stop nodding, Thomas. You're disturbing me. Stop nodding. So if you wanted to rebel against that, if you wanted to prove that actually sex doesn't dictate your life, it's a nice to have, but you can equally build a solid life without it. I'd love to get your thoughts on that on 021 446 0567 011 883 0702. There's an SMS here. It says, I'm still trying to wrap this around my head, not to sound shallow or ignorant, but maybe there is some sort of chemical that is not released by the brain causing people to be asexual. I'm not judging, but I just can't fathom. I don't think there's anything wrong with that SMS actually. And I also confessed when we started the conversation that, look, I come from a very uninformed place. I didn't realize that there was such a thing. And I was also fascinated to know, I was also interested to know whether there was a medical reason why somebody would be asexual. And I love the maturity with which the questions were sent through. There was no judgment at all. I think people just want to know, and I put your question in that same category. You're not the only one. And Ash in Roodepoort also asked, is asexuality not simply a state of mind? Can an asexual person make a willing and deliberate choice to change orientation or not? That is from Jack. Okay, 021 446 0567 011 883 0702. Tsepo in Basonia.
Hello, Redi. Hi. I mean, I work as an artist, and sometimes, when I create new work, I find that when I give up certain things, what I call transvaluation, seeking to transcend daily norms and values, and one of them being giving up sex, I find that I have other insights that help my creative process.
Wow. Okay. Thank you very much, Tsepo. That's very, very interesting. And when you go back, you just simply pick up where you left off, right?
No, it's not that easy, because now you have to take yourself out of that sort of trance, to get back to the daily sort of rhythm of life. But also, it comes from the fact that, a lot of artists, used to work as prophets. So if you're a prophet and you want to have a closer, sort of like a nearness to a spiritual form, there are certain things you have to give up.
Oh, lovely call. You know what I do, Tsepo, to get creative? If I have writer's block and I have to write, you know what I do?
No.
I put my cell phone in my boot.
And
I sit in the garden and write. It all comes back to me.
Okay.
Okay.
But remember that word, transvaluation.
Yeah.
I'm saying, remember that word, transvaluation, seeking to transcend daily values.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much. And there is an SMS here that says, yes, I have given up sex and I feel better about myself. It has made me clearer, spiritually deeper. And really, I tried giving it up once, longest week of my life. That is from Voter. Voter. Have a lovely, lovely weekend. Do take care of yourself. This conversation will be available as a podcast. I'll see you again